So if we start with the environment overall, like this complex topic that apparently we're not allowed to talk about, it's right or left, or it's black and white, and there's like no, and I believe I like the way foreign policy described you. They said that you're a person that takes the black and white out of climate politics. And I really, really like that. And I found myself many times with a lot of my environmentalist friends trying to explain to them your position, because right away they start categorizing like, oh, denier, like on the other side, or like some kind of an agenda. And I'm like, no. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time like really just breaking down your stance in a few basic positions that I've kind of simplified. And you can maybe comment on each one and correct me if I'm wrong. So if we start from the top, you believe that, and again, I don't see, personally, I've never seen the environment as like a right-left. I think we should all care about the environment, even if you're on the right wing. And typically, you'll even see people like more on the right wing, they'll have this actual more connection sometimes with nature and care more about, care about things like, the pollution in a river or like things like that. And so it's something that we should all care about. But if we start from the top, you believe, and we focus in on this, the climate change issue. You believe that climate change exists and that it's a problem that we need to confront on some level. Is that accurate?
Yes, it's both. It's real, it's happening, it's man-made, and mostly it's a negative impact. Yeah.
Okay. And so that was number two. You believe that it's to some degree caused by humans, especially some of our industrial practices, particularly our reliance on coal-related energies. Is that also fair to say?
Yes. Okay. And just to sort of shortcut this whole thing, I simply buy wholesale into the whole UN climate panel scientific findings. Look, I'm a social scientist. How would I know better? I think there's a lot of people who are arguing this, and I think it's great that they are. But fundamentally, if we're going to have a sensible political conversation about this, I'm simply taking the standard view, the UN climate panel on the science bit, just right.
Okay, great. 3, and this is maybe an important departure point, and you've mentioned it quickly. You do not subscribe to the climate apocalypse hypothesis. In other words, you do not believe that we are facing an imminent, inevitable catastrophe. In other words, it's not to be understood as a meteor hurling towards planet Earth. Like UN Secretary General Guterres calls it global boiling or suicide or a time bomb. Is that fair? You do not subscribe to that view of it's a meteor coming at us at full speed?
No. And that's, again, because that's not actually what the UN climate panel is saying at all. If you look, I did a tweet on this, but that's more sort of the fun, that's the very condensed version of it. If you look at how many times the UN climate panel uses the words climate change or global warming, lots of times. How many times do they use climate catastrophe, global boiling, any of those many, many words that you see out there, existential crisis? None. Because that's just not what the UN climate panel is telling us. They're telling us that global warming will be a problem, not the end of the world. And that's crucial because, as you just pointed out, if it was the end of the world, then clearly we should just throw everything in the kitchen sink at this. And in some sense, I get why a lot of climate campaigners want to position it as the end of the world. It's a common thing that a lot of people in a lot of different areas say, oh, my area is so important that if we don't do something about it, we're all going to die, so give me all your money. It makes sense if you're an NGO, but it doesn't make sense if you're actually trying to make decisions between a lot of different things, because remember, climate is not the only thing we need to spend money on. We also need to spend money on food and education and healthcare and all these other things. And it's not like they're going to go away. So we need to have a sense of the real size of the problem, not sort of an exaggerated version of it.
I'm curious. I saw once Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile. He's a statistician, and he wrote once, I believe in a tweet, that even if the climate apocalypse were very, very small risk, that it would still be reasonable to disproportionately invest in minimizing this risk, since the outcome is like massive planetary destruction. So as a statistician and as a social scientist, what do you think of this argument?
So this is a very clever argument. It's not correct, but it's a very clever argument. It's a version of the Pascal argument of saying, look, you may not know if there's a God, but if there's just a small chance of there being a God, it's probably better to be Christian, because if you get up there and you didn't believe in him, you're screwed, right? The problem with that argument, of course, is how do you know it's a Christian God? What is the risk that it could have been, Islamic God or a Hindu God or something else? So, whatever you end up believing, you'll sort of have screwed up all the other ones. So, by some count, there's 4,000 different deities. So if you believe in one of them, you have 3,999 chance of failing on actually having chosen the right God. Now, this is obviously just fun, but it's important because this really tells us it's not the only thing that potentially could go catastrophically wrong. So this was actually a big discussion between the climate economist called William Nordhaus, who ended up getting the Nobel Prize. He's the only guy to get the Nobel Prize for climate economics. And another guy who was making essentially the argument that you just made, and I'm forgetting his name right now, which is terrible, but there you are. But his argument was there's a fat tail risk. So, it could go fantastically wrong, so we should spend all of our money on climate change. Nordhaus' argument was very interesting, and they went on for a very long time. His argument was, well, what about all the other fantastically risky things? AI is one that we talk a lot about. Gray goo that, sort of small micro machines could actually end up taking over the world and make everything into gray goo. What about an asteroid? What about everything else? There's a ton of things. Very obviously, the fact that North Korea has lots of nuclear weapons and, they only seem to be getting worse into the 21st century. There's lots of things that we should be concerned about. Obviously, pandemics and so on. Should we be spending all of our money on all of these things? You can't. You can only spend all your money at once. And so he actually had a very, very interesting point and a data point. So back in the late 1990s, NASA came up with a proposal to detect 90% of all the meteors that potentially could end up hitting Earth. Now, we know that that's a way the world could end. It's ended, or at least ended for a very large number of species. So this is really a planet killer possibility. Now, it only happens once every about 100 million years or thereabout. So it's not something you need to be awake of every night, but it is a real risk, and multiplied by the fact that we don't want to go extinct. That's a huge issue. Maybe we should be spending all our money there. So NASA sent to the U.S. Congress a proposal. We can find 90% of these within the next 5 years for this amount of money. We can also find 99% for a larger amount. And U.S. Congress said, okay, we'll do the 90%, but not the 99. And what Nordhaus points out is that they did what any reasonable person would do. We're going to buy some, but not all of it. We're not going to get all the protection. But they implicitly actually set a price on the extinction of the human race, right? Because we decided, 9% reduction of the risk of human extinction is just not worth those extra billions. And we do this all the time.
Yeah.
We make these decisions, and we need to make these decisions because we have to trade off with a lot of other things. Remember, everyone will tell you, oh, my area is the most important that you could possibly invest in. And if you don't invest here, we're going to lose out on so many different things, and potentially we're all going to go extinct. Well, yeah, but so we do with all other areas. So the fundamental point here is, yes, when you do these models with climate economics and actually say, but there's a real risk of things getting worse than what we expected, it does mean you should spend more, but it doesn't mean you should spend all. It's still very clearly bound because there are a lot of other things that could also go terribly wrong. And so this you only make this argument if you don't think about, well, all the other things in the world that could
the opportunity cost. Yeah, you're assuming that argument, even the Blaise Pascal version of it assumes that there's no opportunity cost and no trade-offs, right? You're sort of...
If there's only one God, then you should believe in him because the alternative is really bad. But if there's a lot of gods, which there are in the real world, it doesn't actually work.
Yeah. And that's it. And it assumes that there's no trade-off. It's like, so that's why I think there's a bad reason for believing in God, for instance, because if the odds are so small, then the trade-off is you're sacrificing the only life that you have, right, on the probability that you're believing in a false God. So it's the same thing here. It's like we're assuming that there's no opportunity cost, but there are trade-offs. There are limitations in resources. Resources are scarce up to a point where you can't just keep printing money and expect there to be no consequence eventually. So you sort of have to balance these things out.
Yeah. Let's just remember, money is only a proxy for stuff we have. So even if you print more money, you don't have more stuff. And the stuff is actually the things that we care about. So yes, you are limited. Yeah.
Right. And I want to get back to that in the context of best things first, in terms of your methodology for calculating these things, including human life, something I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about. But just to close up sort of on the environment side, so the final position is you don't believe that the type of policies many Western governments, especially what we call the environmental movement, are pursuing in the name of tackling climate change are effective, and that they may even cause more harm than good by increasing the price of energy and by diverting resources in the way we just discussed now from issues where we know we can do a lot more tangible good and where there is a lot more data. And you give the example of Germany's Energiewende policy, so the clean energy policy of Germany. Can you please explain for people that are not super well versed in this topic how climate policies and this kind of environmental action can practically cause more harm than good?
Yes. So again, I'm not the guy who's claiming to have all the answers. I'm simply looking at all the guys who've actually done all the work. So in the climate science space, it's the UN Climate Panel, but in the climate economic space, it's the climate economists. And foremost among them is William Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize in climate economics. And his basic point is there's a cost to climate. That's absolutely true. So the higher the temperature goes up, the more damage we're going to see. There's a real cost to that. But there's also a cost to climate policy. So if we try to force people to do stuff they otherwise wouldn't have done, it's because it's actually either less convenient, less useful, or just more expensive. And we see this in a lot of different ways. If you try to push people to electric cars while they're not quite ready, you actually need to incentivize them with thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars in subsidies. If you want to force people to use solar power and wind power, you actually need to give them a lot of subsidies, and that's what we're seeing around the world. Now, we can have this conversation about, are there some of these things that would happen even though, yes, some people would buy electric cars without subsidies? Great, please do. Some people would put up solar panels and wind turbines. That's no problem. We're not arguing about the stuff that people would do without subsidies. That's fine. The point is, if you want to get the world off fossil fuels anytime soon, you need massive subsidies, or more likely massive fines for using it, which is typically understood as a carbon tax. Or you can do much, much less effectively by having a bundle of non-overlapping, non-interacting bad policies. They'll try to promote some things and destroy other things, and then you end up with much, much more costly policies. All of these climate policies, climate economics shows that you should do some climate policy. And that's also what I'm arguing for. We should do some. Cutting the first tons of CO2 is very cheap, and it cuts the very highest end of the temperature outcomes, which are the worst outcomes. So very cheap cost, very high benefits. That you should do.
I'm interested. This is what policy in particular? Can you zoom in on that?
So that would be, you should certainly go from $0 to $1 in a carbon tax. If we just imagine it for global, but it's never going to happen that way. But you should start. Right now, the world has, say, somewhere between $1 and $2 of effective carbon tax, which is really, rich countries have lots of carbon taxes. Most poor countries have virtually zero. You should definitely move that up, because cutting the first tons of CO2 is very cheap, $1 or $2 by definition. And the benefits are much larger than that, possibly in the tens or maybe even the hundreds of dollars. But as you go up and make more and more taxes, you will eventually reach a point where you are making more costs and lower net additional benefits. Then you should stop. This, if you said this in any other circumstance, people would just be like, that sounds banal. And it is banal. It's just basic economics 101. But in climate, it has become this, no, we need to go all the way. We need to go to net zero by 2050. We need to basically stop using fossil fuels that has powered the last 200 years of industrial progress in order to avoid a climate catastrophe. Now, again, if it's the end of the world, it sort of makes sense to say, yes, we should do everything in the kitchen sink. Nothing can be too expensive. But the reality is, and there's just a new study out in Climate Change Economics, which is a peer-reviewed journal, as the first estimates of the cost and benefits of going net zero by 2050. And I'm just going to give you, it's a long story. There's several estimates both of the cost. There's one estimate of the benefit. But I'm just going to give you the very short version of this. What they find is the average benefit of achieving net zero by 2050 will probably be in the order of $4.5 trillion per year, undiscounted across the 21st century. That's not nothing. That's actually a lot of money. That's worth opening up your eyes for. But the cost of the policy to achieve it will likely be in the order of 26, maybe $27 trillion.
Oh my God.
Paying $27 trillion to achieve a benefit of about $4.5 trillion is a really bad deal. And this is the basic point.
So negative ROI, like very negative ROI with your methodology on measuring the ROIs of policies. This is
every dollar spent will deliver 17 cents of benefits, which is just, that's not a good way to help the world. You're basically throwing away more than 83 cents of every dollar you put in there. And it's not a little bit of money. We're talking about $27 trillion. Wow. Just for context, right now, the global tax intake, so the net ability of all governments in the world to do anything, is about $15 trillion. Now, obviously, we'll become richer throughout the 21st century, but it gives you a sense of proportion. We're almost talking about twice all the spending of all governments in the world every year throughout the century. So again, I'm not saying that we should do nothing. We should actually do smart climate policy, and that involves a bit of carbon taxation. It's probably never going to really work because we've seen it not work in the U.S. We've seen it be very hard in the and Europe and many other places. But we should do some of that. But mostly we should be focusing on innovation because that's the way you're actually going to fix this. But currently, that's not what we're doing. We're all saying, and all politicians are saying, no, we need to go net zero by 2050. And that's just the most incredibly costly policy to achieve very little good for the future of this planet. So net is a very, very bad idea. And it's, again, not me saying this. This is some of the best models, some of the best economists, the only guy to win the Nobel Prize in climate economics, telling us the current set of promises on climate are just a really bad deal.
It's a very interesting psychological phenomenon as well, because I remember from COVID, and even staying out of the political aspect of this, I remember during COVID, it's almost like we sometimes, as a species, like a certain fear captures our attention, and then we sort of narrow our entire consciousness to that fear, and then all we're doing is monomaniacally dealing with that fear, regardless of what the consequences are. We lose our ability to expand our consciousness and look at the overall impact. And I remember this during COVID, and it was like, that's it. The point of life is just dealing with COVID. Like reducing COVID that is the only point of like human life. That if you listen to government, that's the way they were sort of treating it. Just the methodology of it. I was not of the view that we should do nothing. I was not of the view that it was just a common cold. I was not of the view that we should not do anything about it. But this monomaniacal, this is the only thing that matters. And then, after that, the damage to the economy and the damage to people's mental health and so forth. And at some point, like very quickly, it was like, wait a minute, like, are we looking at this in a cost-benefit analysis? Are we measuring?
You're absolutely right. I thought that after COVID, this would be a perfect example for everyone. But of course, what really has happened is that a lot of people have gotten very, very sort of fixated on one or the other side. So in some ways, it's just become a replay of the whole climate conversation. But again, as you point out, fundamentally, COVID was a huge challenge. Flattening the curve was an incredibly smart thing. We know that that's a good idea. It basically makes sure a lot more people survive, to make sure that there's enough hospital capacity. So you may need to make some restrictions to flatten the curve. That makes perfect sense. But once governments realized, I can make fewer people die from COVID. Why is the right number not zero?
Yeah.
And of course, the right number is not zero because it's rarely zero. And, if you look at another thing, on American roads, on European roads, every year about 40,000 people die in each place from traffic deaths. We have a perfect way to reduce that down to zero. Set the speed limit at 5 kilometers an hour. Nobody dies. But of course, you don't actually do that because you have other things you want to optimize as well. And we know that we make optimization when we say, sure, it should be 55 or 75 miles an hour, or 130 kilometers an hour. But it's not 3 miles or 5
what I think it is? You know what I think it is? I think it's the uncertainty. I think it's like we've gotten used to people dying from car crashes. Yes. So the fact that we know more or less how many people we're like, okay, there's no uncertainty there. But as soon as there's uncertainty, we think, oh my God, it could be endless. It could be like, as it's the uncertainty that gets us like irrational, I think.
And there's certainly a certain part of that, but I would argue that a lot of other things, so very clearly, why are we not more worried about future pandemics? Because clearly they could cost us all of our lives. Why are we not worried about meteors hurtling towards Earth that could eradicate all life as we know? Why are we not more worried about North Korea? Why are we not more worried about AI or gray goo and all these other things? So I think it is partly the worry of endless terrible outcomes, but it's also because we get massaged on this particular point from media. Yes. So during COVID, it was COVID that was all that mattered, and that was all everybody talked about.
We can only focus on one at a time. We can only have have room for one great fear at a time. It's completely irrational. All these other fears exist, but
I think it makes perfect sense for humans that we have a hard time dealing with many things at once. But of course, we should recognize that we are actually, as a species, dealing with many things at once. Yes. And I, for one, am incredibly grateful that there's a lot of smart people who are working on a lot of things I had no idea was problems. But they're actually figuring it out. And there's a lot of doctors that'll figure out a lot of diseases I've never heard of, but that I might actually have died of had they not been looking at it, and all these things. So we should definitely be investigating all these things. We need to recognize it is not such that we can just avoid catastrophe by shutting down essentially the engine of economic growth and go to net zero without a huge loss in. And it seems very likely that that is just a very bad idea. And so, again, if you've listened so far into the conversation, you've basically heard, yes, the UN Climate Panel is right. The climate economists, the best and brightest climate economists, are also right. And they're basically telling us, on the basis of the science, it's a problem, not the end of the world. We should do something, but not all. And that's really the basic point. And I don't think it's very controversial to say it, but clearly it is, because it upsets a lot of people.